Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all can hear me. I want to make sure. This is Michael Volkov for the webinar on how to monitor, audit, and improve your anti-corruption compliance program. If you have any technical difficulties, please you can send me a message on the questions or the chat function. I think actually the questions function is the one that's enabled right now. But please let me know if you're having any problems in hearing me. Number two, anyone who would like a set of the slides once we're done, please feel free to send me an email. My email address is on the first page there, mvolkov@volkovlaw.com. And be happy to send you the slides afterwards. We'll also, I am recording this as well, so if there are other folks you know who wanted to listen to this or whatever, I usually post it or we'll send out a link to the recording in case you want to do that. And it's a recording which includes the slides itself as you're going through it. Again, if you do have if anybody has any problems in hearing me, please let me know, and I'll try to address the technical problems as we go along. Thank you all for showing up. I appreciate that, and apologize for being a few minutes late. I was not late because my wife was making me drink my espresso for the morning, but I apologize again, and we'll try to make it up here. I think this topic of how to monitor a compliance program and audit a program is really very, very important. And the reason is, if you saw, there's a recent survey that was just put out by Kroll and Compliance Week that many companies now, not every company, but many companies have put into place, for example, due diligence procedures. Many companies have put into place basic anti-corruption compliance programs, and where the rubber meets the road in terms of the transformation of what is called a paper compliance program, and it's used in a derogatory way by the DOJ and the SEC, where you transform it into what I would say the goal of having an evolving working compliance program is in this area. Through monitoring, auditing, periodic evaluations, these types of sort of mechanisms are really, I think, sort of the cutting edge new area where compliance people and compliance programs are focused. Everybody gets now how to do a lot of the basic functions for an anti-corruption compliance program, how to do due diligence of third parties. This is sort of what I consider the sort of new area, and I'm seeing a variety of tools and a variety of approaches that people are implementing. But there's a lot of good work that's going on out there in the industry, and it's something that we all should sort of pay attention to try to get a little bit more sort of industry knowledge and share it with each other. So these are the issues we're going to sort of go through today in terms of this issue. As always, I start with the background from the sentencing guidelines and from the FCPA guidance, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Starting first with the guidelines, there are several requirements. There are 3 provisions which refer to this in terms of the definition of an effective compliance program, which is a good guidance to follow. It's very general, but I mean it's a good guidance in terms of the principles. And that is, it emphasizes, the guidelines basically emphasize monitoring, auditing, testing, periodic evaluations. Periodic is going to be an interesting term when we get to that. But they also want to see reasonable steps to monitor and audit your program to make sure you can, and how well it's doing to detect criminal conduct. They want you also, the guidelines outline that you should evaluate periodically the effectiveness of your compliance program. If a violation is detected, they want to know that you're doing something then to prevent future violations, that you learn why it happened and then improve your program. And in general, there's this sort of continuous flow and evolution in your program. Your program should be tinkered with. For mechanics, I was never very mechanically inclined. For all those mechanics out there, it definitely is something that you need to look at. Periodic testing, assessment, and improvement of a compliance program. And periodic, can mean people like to think of it as annual. It can be a little, or even within the year, but that really depends upon the size of your organization, the risks that you face, and things like that. The FCPA guidance itself also underscores the importance of this issue, and the guidance itself talks about, does the company regularly review and improve compliance programs? They want to see continuous improvement, and the reason the FCPA, the DOJ and SEC really played on this is they are sick of seeing what I call the paper programs. They want to see real compliance. They don't want to just see all the policies in place and a few words thrown at the top, and that's all that happens. They said that, quote unquote, meaningful credit will be given to companies that monitor and improve their programs. And the reason that the justification for the continuous improvement requirement is that they recognize that a company's business changes over time. The markets you operate in, the new markets you go into, the markets you withdraw from, whatever. Local laws change. The nature of your customers, your mix between government and private customers may change, and standards within the industry. An organization, they urge you to take time to review and test your controls, and then think critically about your potential weaknesses and your risk areas. So the guidance basically holds out the, look, we're going to give you meaningful credit for your performance in this area, and we want to see sort of a positive movement in this area. We want to see something that's being done. So what does monitoring and auditing really do? What are we looking for? And I hate to use, you can see that this is one of the first times I figured out how to use these diagrams and whatever, and you'll see 2 slides like that. But first is there has to be sort of the movement from paper to an evolving compliance program requires that you somehow gather information, and we're going to talk about how you're going to proactively gather information about the operation of your program. This is my presentation in this is not going to be very theoretical. Once we get past this, it's going to be very sort of practical in terms of realistic about what you can do and what you can't do and what's realistic in that sense. But you're going to take information and you're going to have a risk assessment foundation. In other words, the risk assessment foundation, when you built this program to begin with, you started with a risk assessment of some sort. You were able to tailor the program to those risks. And now, as you collect information, what they want to see you do is plug that into your risk assessment foundation and update. And then you're going to evaluate and modify your program, and that's going to give you the evolving compliance. Even if it's tinkering with it, even if it's changing it a little bit, saying you're going to do certain things in certain countries. For example, saying you're going to look more closely at third parties that come in through a particular country or a particular region, and we're going to do more in terms of that. Anything that you can do that you can say you're doing it because of this updating information that you're getting in, which we're going to talk about, anything that you're going to do to get to tie to a change in the program itself or a policy, you can say is part of this evolving compliance program, and that's what you want. That's what you really want to try and do. So again, you can see I really enjoyed playing with the diagrams here, but this is what I call it the continuous improvement cycle. And the continuous improvement cycle goes from you start with your risk assessment, you have your compliance program, you then go down and start to monitor and audit, and you're starting to collect information. And then you're going to have, and you may have a periodic evaluation of your entire program or parts of your program. You can do that. For example, I like to do a, focus on your third-party risks and try to reduce those risks. That may be part of my periodic evaluation. Then I'm going to look at changing the compliance program improvements, making changes to policies and procedures that follow from this sort of lessons learned process along the bottom. And then it goes back to your risk assessment. You're going to update your risk assessment and then modify again your compliance program, and then boom, you're collecting more information. Each year you're going to be collecting information in this cycle. And I think this is a good way to try to think about it. And if you articulate it and set up a structure like this, a lot of times you may be doing it just innately, but you need to sort of think about writing up policies or writing up what you're doing, because then you can document what you're doing, and then the government, if unfortunately you get to that situation where you have to show this to the government can see that you instituted a new policy, and that's what you did. So your first step always, and this is sort of a practical approach to how you do this, and I'm going to give you some step-by-step approach for monitoring and auditing, is to identify your risks. So you start with your risk assessment, and you try to rank your risks in terms of, what is really bugging you? What is the real, it's hard to measure one risk versus another. For example, is the risk of, abuses in gifts, meals, and entertainment and travel, particularly in the medical industry, let's say, or healthcare industry, where you have sponsorships that foreign doctors request to go to various conferences around the world. Is that a bigger risk than your third parties distributors, let's say, for a healthcare company, pharmaceutical or medical device company? Well, it's hard to say. You can't really do that. There's no real measure of that. Within the area, within the categories, I'm going to show you some ways you can rank your risks. Your focus should always be on sales interactions with foreign officials, obviously your company employees, and then your focus should be on not just sales interactions, but regulatory interactions with foreign officials, Met, customs, health, zoning. We've been through these. And then you sort of move it on to your third-party intermediaries, sales and regulatory interactions, distributors and agents. I think people should focus, and I don't think I'm getting the feeling there's not as much focusing on due diligence in acquisitions, but there really needs to be more sort of proactive focus in this area. And then gifts, meals, and entertainment. These are sort of identifying your risks. You may have other risks of facilitation payments, for example, that are routinely requested, but that's going to be by customs, health, zoning, or those types of things that you have to deal with. But the first step is to know your risks and identify your risks, and your risk assessment should give you some feel for that, or you can go from there. If you don't have a risk assessment, a formal one, you can try to do some type of sort of assessment of where you see that. The second step is to identify your tools for monitoring, auditing, and whatnot. And this, we're going to spend more time on these tools, and I'll go through them with you and how you sort of stack them up together. You have what I would call employee surveys or employee information that can be gathered, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Desktop audits are usually what I call sort of telephone interview audits, where you can get information from people, your distributors or your offices, your sales offices. You can get information from them, but you can't get down to the local paperwork. So, for example, you can find out about certain transactions, but if you wanted to, but you're not going to be able to get the local paperwork. You've got to actually go to the office and pull those particular transactions and the paperwork justification behind it. If you have a system, internally in your company where you get all the paper, then you may be able to do more from what I call the desktop audit. So desktop audit is a little bit more general than the other categories that we're going to talk about. Transaction testing is exactly, there's a lot written about that in terms of looking at a bunch of transactions and then looking for outliers, looking for things that don't make sense. When I say here underneath internal and external, I mean there's internal for dealing with your sales folks and dealing with your people who are on the front lines, and then the external refers to agents and distributors or third parties. You also can do issue spot checks, which are, for example, one issue spot check that I have done before is to say, let's pull all of the contracts in Tanzania with third parties. We have 20 third-party agents there, or we have distributors there, or whatever, and let's see whether or not we have a written contract with each of them. And if we do have a written contract, let's see, do we have FCPA compliance terms in there or not? More specific audits and sort of the more time-intensive audits, which have to be part of any program, are the financial and compliance audits. Now, it's funny to me, the term audit gets thrown around, and they're really a couple of, there's two types of financial audits, and there's a compliance audit. And when I use the term audit, I like to include a financial and compliance audit, meaning I don't just want to send in the accountants to look for weird transactions, weird paperwork, things like that, because, I mean, and they're fully capable of looking at compliance issues as to whether or not there's certifications from all the employees, whether or not the third-party procedures are being followed, whether or not people are attending training and things like that. But I'd like to have a compliance person go with the financial people to do the audit. So financial, in terms of the two types of financial audits that we look at there, everybody knows about the financial audit, which is based on materiality, meaning that transactions are looked at under the microscope of materiality. Was it a material transaction? And then within those, they look, okay, we have material transactions. Are we looking for something funny? To me, the forensic audit, which is, can go down to how was a penny spent, is obviously what needs to be done in these audits. And I'm not saying you have to, depending upon the number of transactions that occur, or all the expenditures that are made, the more you can do a forensic type audit, the better. And we'll talk about those as well. The other two, which I'm not going to spend as much time talking about, are the office or country or region-specific compliance program reviews. You can people, I have seen companies do, okay, we're going to look at compliance and our overall performance in Russia. And it'll be a country-specific compliance program review, which may include financial audits. Not every office, let's say you had 20 offices in Russia, but maybe pick out 5 and do a financial type of audit. You could do compliance program reviews probably at all 20 because those aren't as time intensive. And then there's the periodic compliance assessment, which is a broad sort of how are we doing as a company. That's even broader than a region-specific or a country-specific. It really looks at the overall performance of the program. Okay. So step 3, and it's a 3-step process, is designing a plan. And, you have sort of monitoring and auditing resources. So the compliance person has to work closely here with internal audit. That's your bread and butter. You're going to work with the auditing people and developing an auditing plan. I've seen compliance people work very, very well with internal auditors. They realize they both need each other. And in most companies, I see them working well together. On the other hand, I've also seen, stovepipe situations where the compliance people aren't necessarily proactively working with the internal auditors, and boy, that can be a very dangerous situation because there are a lot of controls that need to be put in place from a compliance perspective when dealing with the internal auditors. So you want to make sure you deal with them and have a good relationship with them. So we're going to look at, you're going to have a limited amount of resources. I mean, nobody has the ability to audit the entire company every year unless you're, Pepsi or Lockheed or something like that. So monitoring and auditing your resources based on risk. We're going to talk about sort of the way you obviously look at your risk assessment, and there are a number of sort of subjective factors that can always come in to your plan, and those can be, your interactions, the amount of interactions that various offices have with foreign officials, if you have internal reports of corruption risk, or internal reports of, let's say bribery demands made by people in foreign governments, that's going to raise a subjective factor. You're going to have the business perception in general of what the corruption risk is, the importance of your business operations in specific areas. For example, if it turns out China is hugely important to your company's future growth and the way that they're planning to grow in the future, that to me is an important subjective factor that leans towards let's look at them. And obviously, if there have been any prior violations or internal investigations or problems that you've had in the past, that's going to be something as well. A lot of companies use sort of an objective formula for risk ranking formulas, and we're going to talk about that in some of the factors you can use. And then, so I would use together, I would sort of collaborate between internal audit and if legal is part of this as well, I would bring legal into it because they also see, issues, they get questions on this. The best thing, and I've written about this on my blog before, is if you have the three amigos working together, and that's legal, internal audit, and compliance, that the three officers can come together and put together a pretty good plan based upon the subjective and the objective factors we're going to get to in a minute. And so you assign then a combination of monitoring and auditing requirements or tools to gather information depending upon the specific risks. Okay? So here is what I was talking about in terms of putting together your annual audit plan. It's good to have an audit plan. I'm not saying you're going to meet it every year. I've never seen anybody get to the amount of offices they plan to get to. It's a labor-intensive process to go out and visit offices and to do the financial and compliance audits. So make sure you have a plan, make sure you have an audit plan that includes and extends to compliance audits. In other words, the compliance policies, training, certifications, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that as we go along. And this is obviously a continuous process during the year. As you gather information, it's coming in, you need to sort of take a fresh look at it, review it, and then factor it into your compliance program. We talked about your subjective measurements, and then also your focus is always on risks and a fresh assessment of the risks, because that informs what you're going to do with your compliance program in terms of tinkering or making changes. So let's talk about formulas for ranking risks. This is most helpful in the area, and there's basically two classes of risks that you can assign these factors to. One is all of your third parties and distributors. You can say, okay, let's apply a formula for ranking risks, or you can do just distributors or do just agents. And those are your external, rankings of risks. And this is probably the most important area where you can conduct auditing is of your third parties. Typically and hopefully you have auditing rights. in a contract. You also can do internal audits of your sales group or various offices to make sure that, let's say, an office in a very difficult environment in India, and there's a sales staff there, that they are in particular working effectively, and you can then start to rank your offices. It's hard to rank offices versus distributors and agents. Usually you can rank internally your offices which are most suspect. So some of the factors that people, and basically it's a formula where you assign a weight and percentage weights, for example, and you can have a point scale if you want for sales revenues, let's say 0 through 5, and set up 5 different sales revenue categories and assign a weight to that score. So let's say you had a sales revenue which is 0. 1 is 1 million, 2 is 2 million, 3 is 3 million, 4 is 4 million, 5 is 5 million, and then you assign a sales revenue weight of 10%. So you assign 10% to that particular, wherever the distributor or third party falls in terms of sales revenue. And that makes sense. You don't want to necessarily spend the resources on a place that may have weak controls, operates in a highly corrupt area, but basically their sales are $20,000 a year. It may not be worth it. So you want to make sure there's a sales revenue factor. The increase in sales over the last year is important, because if that's another factor that you can include, and that would be an increase in sales over the last year. And what you're looking for are big jumps, and big jumps which may be unexplained, particularly by other factors. Was there a huge increase in demand? Well, not usually. You usually have planned for that, and the increase in sales could be from the corrupt payments, paying bribes to get increased sales in a particular location. Whether or not the third party or distributor has executed a written agreement with compliance provisions should be another factor. That can be as much as 20 to 40%, I've seen. Corruption perception index for the country, that is usually pretty high, between 20 and 40%. Percentage sales to the foreign government. For example, if your distributor sells over 50% of their products their sales is to foreign government customers, then this factor would then apply. Same with the last date of the audit. Has it been over a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and you assign certain point scores and a weight. Have they been trained with the third party or distributor? Has the third party been trained at all by you for anti-corruption purposes? Length of the relationship. Sometimes, a lot of times I've seen with distributors and agents that if you go back to some of these agents or distributors that a company's been dealing with for 20 years, there's no agreement. There's a letter that says, hey, we're just doing this, and the two owners know each other very well. And that is something that I think can be factored in, probably not as large as your corruption perception index or your percentage sales or your written agreement or your increase in sales. Those to me are sort of your 4 core ones. But you use a formula and then you apply it to all of your distributors or all of your agents, and you come up then with a risk ranking. And this is very, very helpful. And I'm not saying that you can adjust the formula after a year if you found it wasn't very helpful, but you're basically saying these are the most risky people, and these are the people we need to spend the most time with in terms of audits and the types of audits that we're going to do, and it helps you to allocate then your resources among all of these competing interests. So let's go through now some of the tools that you can use and what I've seen. I've definitely, employee surveys or surveys are very helpful information. They're not really They're not audit specific, they're not risk ranking specific, but for example, you could use them, and if you have the ability to do it through online technology, it's even better. The more focused, general surveys of like what's your perception of tone at the top and corruption and things like that are, they're helpful, but I find them really like less valuable than a focused survey. So when I say a focused survey, you actually send a survey to the people in Russia from your company and say, what do you think? What's your perception of this? Where are the risks? Do you see a risk in dealing on regulatory issues? Do you see a risk in dealing with sales? And get as many comments as you can. The more general surveys are helpful for measuring tone at the top. Is your tone at the top getting out? And it's one quick way to get tone at the top. I've always encouraged people to do surveys for tone at the top, meaning what is the message that you get from senior leadership at our company, from the board, from anyone? What is that? I also like to make sure that HR exit interviews are done. In other words, when people leave, you're not going to get a lot of people send a follow-up online survey. Maybe you'll get, after people leave, 50% participation if you're lucky. But to me, it's a very valuable insight that you can get in terms of surveys, because sometimes people will tell you the honest truth, because they're not there anymore and they don't have an interest in sort of not being as honest. I also will, for example, target surveys towards people who do have the interactions with the foreign government, let's say in the top 10 countries that I have a risk, or that I perceive a risk. Same with agents or distributors. And I like to go into emerging markets and definitely get surveys there in terms of their perception of corruption or the conditions there. And I'm going sort of in terms of what I consider resource-intensive monitoring techniques that can be used. Transaction testing is something that can be very helpful. And if you can afford it, sometimes I would urge people to use an outside auditor, but under not like, a blank check type of thing, but a very focused type of program where they would, and I call them transaction testing dumps, or you can do it in a more specific, sort of select way. And what I mean by that is you go in and, for example, I put together programs where on a quarterly basis we're going to go into these 8 offices because they operate in a highly, high-risk areas, and we're just going to take, sort of a random, like, 500 transactions, and take those and and if you have a centralized location in your company, it makes it even easier. If you have a central location where all transactions go through, that's fantastic. But usually companies don't. But they nonetheless can take dumps of data from, let's say, regional centers, regional processing centers that companies have around the globe, and they can do a dump. They can do a dump and go through the transactions and run them through some particular criteria. And what you're trying to do is basically see if you can find some unusual transactions, either the size of a transaction, unusual patterns of payments, whether or not these are authorized payments, were they by an approved supplier, there was a valid contract, and obviously the identity of the payee. So there are lots of ways that you can sort of dump transactions and look at them. And in this sense, I would, you can do it annually, you can do it biannually, quarterly, every 30 days, whatever you want to do. But there's a way to set up sort of what I consider a less resource-intensive transaction testing based on these dumps. And as opposed to saying, okay, let's fly our internal auditors out of there and you guys pick out 50 transactions and go through them. and go through the paperwork. There is a value to that, but I look at this as a less resource-intensive, proactive approach where you can get a lot of credit for using transactions and testing those particular transactions. I mentioned issue spot checks. An issue spot check to me is, in a sense, it's we're going to talk about desk audits next, but a targeted desk audit which basically seeks answers to specific questions. So, for example, on an issue spot check, you can focus on a particular country, a particular region, APAC or Asia, or some type of area, or an industry, meaning a product that, one product line, a specific type of risk, and the issue. And here are the types of spot checks you can do. You can look for, these are just examples. Do we have written contracts with our third parties in Tanzania? Let's take a look at what are the employee complaints coming out of the Asia region, okay? And we're going to just look at those and do a deeper dive on some of those. How are gifts, meals, and entertainment expenses and the procedures and the policies being followed in the office in China, for example? And we're just going to take an issue spot check. Are people attending training and then certifying as to compliance? Where are low, how about if we did it like this? Last year, what was our lowest rate of attendance and certification? Or what was our lowest number, where were the most outstanding certifications? And then take an issue spot check and look at training attendance and certification for the next year. As you're in the middle of the year, this is a proactive measure, and we will respond to it. One of the areas that I think I mentioned that people are still sort of behind the curve on is how to integrate your acquisition targets. I'm still running into situations where a company has bought somebody, let's say in China, an ongoing operation, and 5 years later they've never been integrated into even the IT system or any of the compliance procedures. They even still use some of their old stationery. The point is that there has to be, and an issue spot check to me, one of the more valuable ones is look at an integration target, look at a target that has been acquired, and it's, let's say, 2 years later, and then go through an issue spot check of have they been integrated into the entire set of controls? Have they been trained? Have they been certified? Are they on our online system for certification, assuming you have one? So that's what I would, I would try to get into these areas. These are very focused areas, and I think they could really, be very, very helpful and targeted in that sense. Now, your desktop or phone audits. So, for example, here's how I would use these. These are usually telephone calls and interviews. And the desktop or phone audit should be conducted, let's say, in conjunction with your risk ranking and your more formal audits, which we're going to talk to in a minute. But they, to me, would be, let's say you identify 7 to 10 offices that you want to visit that year and do a very thorough audit of compliance and finances. Offices or distributors that come down a little bit lower, that fall a little bit lower than those, I would probably try to do desktop or phone audits with them by a compliance person, or 2 people, hopefully, on the phone to go through a sort of, audit where you can't dig into the paperwork, but nonetheless you can sort of look around on some of the issues. So, for example, I would have telephone calls that then go out to these offices, and I would have a telephone audit which consists of, you interview, let's say, your country manager, your sales manager, or anybody else that you think would be appropriate. That's, who handles all the books, who handles all the, gifts, meals, and entertainment type of policies and procedures. You obviously are limited in terms of your ability to go through financial documents, but you want to try to focus on what is the local office doing with regard to your compliance policies and procedures. Are they really following them or not? Do they have local compliance policies and procedures? Anything that you can get in terms of documentation that they can email you. Hopefully your company has an intranet where you can, verify things would be great. You want to know, are people attending training and are they certifying online? And if they're not, you want to know why not. And hopefully you can start to talk to the country manager, sales manager, or someone there who can give you some feedback on that. Are they following the third-party due diligence requirements? In other words, are they hiring agents or distributors and making sure that they're run through the due diligence process that has been established? Do they have written contracts with third parties and distributors? Are there any unusual expenses? Are there employee complaints? What's going on with that? And you generally want to get a tone, a real picture of what is going on out there in the field on a compliance basis. And you may, the desktop audits can be very, very helpful because perception is really important. And it's really taking the time to do, 2 to 3 or maybe, a little bit more in terms of interviews. And the interviews don't have to be that long. They don't have to be that thorough. But at least that you're doing them and reaching out to people and letting them know that you're there. A lot of times, I'll be honest with you, when the desktop audits go out to distributors, distributors aren't aware of any compliance obligation. And it at least gives you feedback so that you can cycle back on the need for getting information out to these folks and hopefully getting them on board with some type of compliance program. So these are very helpful and less time intensive than the more, the boots on the ground type of audits. And I find these to be very, very helpful for informing your compliance program. So take a look at, look at that. Your more formal audits. These are like your, top risk ranked offices, either be them internal or external. These being a distributor or a third party, these are going to be, these are going to be important. So I would take a look at that. Before we get to that, I have one question or a comment, I think, from someone that says, if you use outside due diligence companies, it is difficult to ensure they are well recommended. Therefore, he was suggesting that you immediately do a due diligence on your own company and sign up with different due diligence companies. In other words, I guess the point is, and this is a good point too, that you do your own internal due diligence as well, and don't necessarily rely on the outside Crowells and Prellers and whatnot for the due diligence, and that you can do your own internally. And that's a good suggestion in terms of doing some of the follow-ups. In other words, you don't always have to contract out to somebody to do that. It may be that internally you could do a desktop audit, or you could do some type of thing to get a better feel for a third party. Okay, let's talk about the audit schedule and your plan. Now you're doing auditing, and the question comes up, this is your formal audit where hopefully a compliance and a financial team are going to go and visit a particular office. And you always have sort of a plan as you get out there what you're going to do. And you start, in my view, with the head of the office always to get a feel for the place. And you may have an exit interview when you're leaving to help, give some feedback to the head of the office. But you're going to have a meeting with the head of the office. You're going to get an organization chart in advance, hopefully, so that you know how the office is established, who goes where, what is done by each person. And it's important just to get a feel for the office from the head of the office. And then I would interview a cross-section of employees on the compliance tone and any specific issues that come up. Some of the issues that you're going to look at, part of these get divided up between compliance audits and what I would call the financial audit side, and those are employee and third-party training. Then you're going to have third-party due diligence and identification of third parties based on your examination of the due diligence files. Hopefully they have some. You're also going to look at their customers and their suppliers and look at who their customers and suppliers are and look for, obviously, state-owned enterprises or government that you're dealing with. And then the financial part is really going to focus, in my view, on the accounting policies, fees, and payments. They're going to look for unusual transactions, sample contracts, payment receipts, and look how these are done. You know, I'll give you an example of one that became very interesting was that people were putting in, you know, for a certain amount, let's say $2,000, and they had 4 receipts in there, and it turned out the receipts were all the same and all on the same day for a particular, let's say, taxi service. So it was very clear that there was something else going on here, that the receipts were being, you know, put in falsely to cover money that was used for another purpose. That is what you're looking for. And you have to follow up on those, and you have to talk to the people who filled out those forms, and those can be very interesting conversations. So you have accounting policies, fees, and payments. That's going to be your financial people, your disbursements, all your cash, where your cash is going, your petty cash, and then you're going to have gifts, travel, and entertainment. Those 3 issues towards the bottom there are going to be right in. That's what the financial folks are going to focus on. They'll also help you, I think, in looking at customers and suppliers. The due diligence process, the training, the policies, whether the compliance policies are getting out there, and the employee issues at the bottom there, and escalation procedures is something that you are going to be, if you're the compliance person on this trip, you're going to be focused on as well. But you're going to work hand in hand with the auditors because, you know, if they sort of identify particular transactions that they need to follow up on, that's what's going to happen. You're going to be part of that process, and you're going to need to do that as well. So, I mean, this is your plan in terms of your audit schedule, your audit plan, and how you're going to handle it. And these are, you know, reserved for sort of your highest risk offices, and these should give you a very good feel for, you know, what's going on in the office. Obviously, you're looking for suspect transactions, and those are going to have, and whether or not they're following the controls as they're required to. So, like I said, your audit team includes your internal audit and compliance staff, and you should have one. The reason why I like to send compliance people out on these audits and not rely just on an internal auditor is it gives you exposure to the offices, which I think is important. It underscores the important role that compliance plays, and it also gives you an opportunity to educate and train people through meetings, conversations, and I think I like to see compliance out, you know, on the field, in the field as well. We got another question which says, in your expense rules and regulations, you should or could have FCPA language and make sure your salespeople read and sign every page as part of the training. That is definitely true. One of the other things when you go out to the offices, and I know this is a pet thing for the DOJ and the SEC, is to make sure that you have materials that are in the foreign language. Everything has been translated and is accessible. Okay. So basically, through all of these techniques that we've outlined here, surveys, going from transaction testing, going from issue spotting, going issue checks, and going through desk audits, going through and then the formal audits, These are all ways to collect information, formal ways to collect information. So you collect all of the information. You can do it on a quarterly basis. You update your risk assessment. And as you're even going through that year, you're going to start the process again to develop a new auditing plan for the following year. And you're going to start the assessment process and the proactive process. And you may get to say, well, okay, we'll get to 5 offices this year. Let's get to the next 2 next year, and then add some more, or whatever. You may recalculate your risks assessment and your risk ranking of third parties and distributors, and you can go from that point. I always like to say you have to come up with an action plan. At the end of your, your monitoring process, your auditing process, you need to develop an action plan, okay? How to make things work better, how to make a compliance program work better. You always want to have a plan because you have to have a tangible result to this. You have to have something. This is not just something you want to just do and then leave out there. So you want to identify what I would call mandatory remedial steps. You want to repair process weaknesses. So for example, in one case we found that this company was acquiring companies, but there was very little attempt made to integrate them into the whole financial accounting process and the controls and everything like that, because they didn't want to upset the company by bringing it into a new process to, they wanted to sort of smooth the integration. Well, that turned out to be a disaster because the controls were out of place and the office went off the map in terms of expenditures and making sure that things were being done right. So that, to me, is you want to repair a process weakness. You want to take a mandatory remedial step. And you may look at changes in your policies and procedures, and there are a million issues that could come up. You could reallocate your resources in terms of your compliance program. Let's not spend so much time on gifts, travels, and entertainment. Let's spend more time on third-party due diligence. Look for unnecessary and burdensome procedures which can be updated. I always look for automation versus personnel going through paper. The more you can automate things and technology solutions come into play, the better you can make your programming. How about you may find that you want to update due diligence for your high-risk agents that have been, let's say, with you for 10 years. They're high risk. Well, let's do a new due diligence on them, okay? And you can identify, you can target a due diligence response for those agents and distributors. Send them a new questionnaire. Say, we want to update this. You can develop what I call distributor and agents codes of conduct. You can have a distributor sign a code of conduct. You can do additional training with your third parties or your distributors or agents. Or you can go to sales staff in a region and hold extra training. Anything you can do that is tied to the collection of this information demonstrates, again, an evolving compliance program. I urge people to send out compliance reminders. The Morgan Stanley case showed us the benefits of that. Do your trend analysis. You develop your trend criteria and analysis. In other words, follow this process year by year by year, and you'll get trends. You'll be able to see trends. You'll be able to see where sore thumbs are sticking out and where you have to address them. Obviously, your focus is always on government interactions and third parties and distributors who have government interactions as well. You want to take your action plan based upon your monitoring results, and you want to present it to, if you have a senior management audit or compliance committee, or you have a board one, either you report to hopefully the audit or the compliance committee, you want to bring them up to speed. You want to include on a quarterly basis, hopefully you're meeting with them 4 times a year, you're going to talk about what you're doing to monitor the program, and this is a very important area to keep your board and your senior management apprised of as you're going through it. And you want it reviewed and ultimately approved by your let's say, recommendations for remedial measures or other things that need to be changed. You want that to be approved by senior management and your board committee. And you want to be realistic and you want to be honest. People are always afraid to write down things, but I think the government likes to see real honesty and that you're trying to address particular problems. They don't like it when people try to cover those over. One last tool that I do in many cases, and actually I've been brought in to do some, is, and I've done these for several companies, is a compliance assessment. It's a review process where you bring in somebody from the outside. It doesn't necessarily have to be from the outside, but I find that it's good to have a new voice and a new perspective. And usually there's intra-company bureaucratic battles over resources and things like that, and whether or not somebody has the right stature within that organization. And to bring in, you can use effectively an outside compliance assessment to help leverage some of the arguments that you, let's say, as a compliance person, are trying to argue for. And so you do it in the context of an annual compliance assessment, and they're not too expensive, and they're not as bad as I can tell you some of the Kroll or other people who do work, or any of the accountants, which you know I vehemently opposed to them doing it. And the comprehensive review of your compliance structure and the processes. Are your policies and processes working? Do you have a tone at the top, which is good and ethical? And it's a review, and it's a continuous process of this review, and then you build it into your action plan. It is something that can be very, very helpful and shows that a company is willing to engage in this. And then you go to your deja vu all over again, and that is, again, you're taking more information, let's say, from your annual assessment, and you're updating your risk assessment. You're taking whatever you did for that year and monitoring and auditing and the results of that and updating your risk assessment, and set up then new priorities, new auditing plans, and then basically, committing yourself to this continuous process for monitoring, assessment, and review. Well, that's all the time we have. Appreciate it. If there are any questions, please feel free to send them to me, or if you would like I said before, I'm happy to give you a set of these slides. If you just email me, I'd be happy to send them to you. I appreciate your all your help and your attendance and your comments. It's always very helpful to stay in touch with people who are doing the real work as well. Okay? Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it, everybody. And hopefully I'll be scheduling something soon, but I appreciate it for another webinar. Just I'll let you know. Thank you, and stay